Yeah, thanks, Tiffany. Yeah, thanks again for the organizers for inviting this paper, and thanks again in advance to Garrett for his comments at the end. So I'm going to talk about our paper evaluating the impact of privacy regulation on e-commerce firms, evidence from Apple's app tracking transparency, which we'll abbreviate as ATT throughout the paper. I'm Guy. This is joint work with Yongku Che, who I see is here on the call as well. Brett Hollenbeck, Maximilian Kaiser, and Daniel McCarthy. And so I wanted to start with I always like this infographic from the New York Times a few years ago. So we're going to talk about sort of privacy regulation. It's useful to talk about third-party tracking. And so this infographic, again, we're going to focus on mobile apps. This is on the web, but kind of a similar dynamic happens there, where again, you can see here's a user kind of going across a bunch of different websites. Here you see them on HuffingtonPost.com. Here's them on WashingtonPost.com. Each of these little dots here is some tracking resource. And these connecting dots are basically a tracking resource that kind of shares unique IDs, right? So when we're going to be thinking about third-party data sharing, this ID is going to allow, for instance, a platform like a Meta to be able to see that a user was on HuffPost.com and went to WashingtonPost.com as well. And why is this a technology that's kind of been developed? The main kind of use of this kind of third-party data tracking has largely been for targeted advertising, right? And so in particular, this can allow two things. The first thing is that it can allow firms to precisely target using granular data on consumers' online behavior, right? So if I'm advertising on, for instance, Meta or Facebook, I might be able to target people that use HuffPost.com if I can kind of link the identity of someone on Facebook to someone who visited HuffPost.com. And beyond just allowing kind of an additional data point for targeting, it also potentially allows for a virtuous cycle of targeting based on measurement, right? So in particular, if I can track a user across a bunch of different websites, I can also measure whether I showed them an ad on Facebook and they ended up converting. And again, this can be used to optimize targeting. Now, of course, if you stared at this, you may have thought, from a consumer perspective, it may be hard to kind of understand or even control kind of the ability to for these firms to kind of collect this consumer data. And again, even if there was sort of no instrumental or sort of payoff relevant reason for you to dislike this tracking, you may sort of intrinsically dislike being tracked across a bunch of different websites. And so at this backdrop, kind of privacy regulation has spun up over the last, it's been around for a while, but it's kind of had become much more prominent in the past few years, where either governments or industry players basically try to balance consumer privacy choices with cost of firms, right? So a lot of those in the audience today in Toulouse, for instance, may be familiar with the General Data Protection Regulation. There's, again, numerous other types of these regulations that have spun up kind of inspired by the GDPR, but there's also been industry initiatives, right? And so here we're going to focus on Apple's app tracking transparency. Again, we're going to title this ATT throughout, which is going to focus specifically on iOS. Google also has a relatively large initiative called the Privacy Sandbox, which at least purportedly will be rolling out next year. But the kind of main point here is, again, both governments and industry players are kind of thinking about how to best balance kind of the trade-off between the costs to firms, the benefits to firms, and the costs to consumers. Now, kind of a naive viewpoint would be to view this as kind of just being zero sum, whereas we kind of take away a little bit from firms, we potentially give some back to consumers. And so I want to think a little bit about kind of what's purportedly been the value of targeted advertising, and in particular, the value of targeted advertising on platforms like Meta, right? And so purportedly, they've enabled the entry of kind of direct-to-consumer firms, right? And so what are these types of firms? You may be familiar with some of the names on here. These are kind of some of the original and most prominent DTC firms like Casper, Bonobos, Allbirds, Warby Parker. And the main idea is that, these are, at least at the start, kind of smaller firms that can sell exclusively on their own website and cheaply acquire consumers through targeted advertisement, right? And purportedly, the kind of rise of social media advertising and targeted advertising online has enabled the success of these type of firms. In 2022, these DTC sales, for instance, reached $155 billion. And so in this paper, we had a conceptually relatively simple question, which is privacy regulations, but in particular, Apple's app tracking transparency. We wanted to quantify kind of what the economic costs of ATT were on these types of firms to try to understand, again, whether or not when we're thinking from the perspective of privacy regulation, whether there's potentially downstream harms to consumers by changes in the composition of product markets. Okay. So let me give like a high level overview of what we do in the paper and our main results, and then I'll dive into all the details. And so the first thing is, again, we're going to try to understand how does this privacy regulation affect advertisers and their bottom line, right? And so the two types of data that we're going to have is we're going to get really granular data on how firms allocate their advertising online, how it purportedly performs, and importantly, kind of their downstream firm revenue, okay? Now, the first question we're going to ask, and again, this is going to be particularly pertinent in the case of ATT, is what is the magnitude of reduced advertising effectiveness on platforms that ex ante were expected to be very effective and in particular impacted, in particular ad platforms like Meta. Okay? And the first thing that we find is that, again, if we look at an event study of kind of like costs per conversion on Meta, there's a very sharp increase that exactly coincides with the onset of ATT. Now, there's going to be some measurement issues that we're going to have to think carefully about, and I'll punt on the details of that till later in the talk. But effectively, what we're going to do is we're going to look within advertiser at types of campaigns that are affected by ATT to those that aren't, to kind of get a causal effect of kind of what's the reduction in effectiveness here. And we're going to focus on click-through rates and find that there's roughly a 37% reduction in click-through rate. Okay. Now, the natural question is, again, we're looking at this policy in the wild. And so if ad platforms like Meta in particular are impacted, the natural question is, how do advertisers kind of respond to this, right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to look just at a very simple event study to show that there's some moderate reallocation from the Meta ad ecosystem to the Google ad ecosystem, okay? And then finally, kind of the core question we want to look at is we really care about kind of the downstream impact on firm side costs here, okay? And so we care about what are the magnitude of revenue reductions. And in particular, we're firms that kind of like were more dependent on Meta advertising, which again, we a link to kind of these direct to consumer firms, were they able to kind of mitigate this shock? And largely what we find is we use measures of pre-ATT dependence on Meta and iOS and find that largely these types of firms were unable to kind of mitigate this shock, leading to a kind of similar 37% reduction in revenue, which is, again, a quite sizable reduction in revenue. And then we look at heterogeneity, and we find that this 37% is largely coming from these sort of smaller direct-to-consumer firms, which, again, kind of puts into question, to what extent does this regulation kind of harm the affect the ability of these types of firms to prosper. And then finally, we have something in the revenue data that's going to allow us to kind of link this back to show that the mechanism is coming from reduced new customer acquisition, again, because of the inability to kind of target advertisements. And so the kind of key punchline takeaway from our paper is that these direct-to-consumer type of business models are threatened by ATT, which again, I think puts some ambiguity into kind of like, how do we think about the welfare effects of these types of regulations for consumers? Okay, so that's the broad overview. Again, get into the full details in the rest of the paper. I think first, before going into those details, I want to briefly talk about some related work. And so kind of within the space of privacy regulation papers, I think kind of the most relevant are those that sort of the economic consequences of ATT. And so the two most relevant are a paper by Wernerfeld et al., which runs kind of field experiments on Facebook, experimentally removing third-party data. And again, relative to this paper, kind of we're looking here at kind of the equilibrium effects of ATT, where we're thinking about how both Meta is adapting, how advertisers are adapting, and kind of measuring to what extent is are firms harmed after they can potentially mitigate the shock. Ciceret and Lemaire also kind of look at reduced ad effectiveness. And again, here we're also going to look at downstream outcomes on firms. There's a number of papers that kind of look at app responses, including Tiffany's paper. Here, again, we're focusing on advertisers and not applications per se. Now, outside of ATT, there's been a number of other papers kind of looking at other types of privacy regulation. And again, hopefully we're getting to the point in the literature where, again, we have all these types of natural experiments generated from privacy regulation. We're slowly learning kind of what are the economic costs of this, and hopefully can allow us to kind of better craft privacy regulation in the future. I think the most relevant of these other privacy regulations is the GDPR, in particular because it has it sort of enables consumers to kind of have opt-in consent. And again, I'm not going to go into, there's a number of really good papers on this topic. Garrett has a really nice review on this. I think the two most relevant are the one that Youngku and I worked on with Tobias, and Garrett's paper with Sam Goldberg and Scott Schreiber, where again they kind of look at the downstream effect on e-commerce firms. I think relative to GDPR, one thing that's really nice about ATT is one, the main provision is really this kind of opt-in data sharing, but two, there's kind of a much cleaner opt-in implementation, because in GDPR, there was a lot of heterogeneity and kind of the extent to which firms were complying with the regulation, the types of opt-in prompts. Here, as I'll show you, there's kind of a very high compliance. And so it's a clean measure, a clean policy to kind of look at the costs of opt-in privacy regulation. And the second is that because it specifically impacts only iOS, we can kind of use it as some variation to say something in particular about kind of the value of meta advertising. And again, I'm a little bit biased here potentially, but we have a Journal of Economic Literature piece coming out later this year, which kind of identified that kind of thinking about the value of these social media ads on downstream product markets is something that's kind of, we don't understand as much about, but seems pretty important. Okay. And so with that, let me dive into the details of the paper. So the first thing is, what is this app tracking transparency? And so if you have an iPhone, you've most likely come across this, right? So after you update to iOS 14.5, if you go to an application, this pop-up comes up where it says, again, this is kind of standardized across all the different applications you see on the phone. Allow this app to track your activity. You can ask the app not to track, or you can allow. Right? And so industry studies that kind of look at the extent to which consumers actually say allow or not allow. So the opt-out rate here is pretty substantial, right? So it's nearly 80 to 85%, according to the industry sources we cite in the paper. And so this is pretty sizable, right? Now, what does this actually do, right? And so a typical use case, in particular, for instance, on a platform like Meta, is what will happen is an advertiser will buy an ad on Facebook, Instagram, or the sort of Meta audience network. What's going to happen is that, an advertiser typically wants to kind of measure, a success for an advertisement, right? So what they typically do is they'll put some pixel on their website or their application that whenever a consumer kind of makes it to that page, it's basically going to send an HTTP request back to Meta and tell them, hey, here's the idea of the person that just converted. And Meta can then use that to measure whether or not an ad worked, again, and optimize distribution, right? So when we're thinking about targeting on a platform like Meta, it's not just kind of like I put in my targeting information, but kind of this delivery optimization also plays a big role. And so the main consequence of ATT is basically this third part. This kind of makes it so that the firm can't share back what's called the IDFA back to the end advertiser, or back to Meta. And so what's the implication of this for advertisers? And so this was expected to kind of disproportionately impact ad platforms such as Meta, in particular, again, iOS-heavy platforms, third-party optimized campaigns. And the result is kind of worse targeting and measurement advertisements, right? First, again, advertiser and Meta kind of can't link ads back to conversions. It really impacts the performance of delivery optimization, but also has less behavioral data. Now, one thing that I think is important to keep in mind as we're going through the paper is that kind of Meta, after the policy, is trying to do a lot of things to kind of potentially adapt to this, right? And so in essence, you can kind of think of a lot of the things that they're trying to do is to move from kind of a deterministic attribution model where, again, I see the ground truth for whether or not someone converts, to a more probabilistic attribution model kind of through this aggregated event measurement. And again, the main idea is to kind of like have some model of conversions for the set of consumers that opt out, right? So Meta is doing some type of adaptation here. Okay, so that's the broad overview for the policy. Again, impacts all the apps on the iOS store, doesn't impact anything off of iOS, okay? Now, what are the data sources that we're going to rely on in this paper? And so we're going to rely on kind of two pretty complementary data sources that kind of in union are going to give us ad spending and revenue data separately for 4,200 global firms, okay? And so the first resource we're going to use is data source A, which again, so I'll refer to it as data source A later, but you can kind of think of it as the data set that we use primarily for revenue, which comes from a firm called Grips Intelligence. And so what kind of data are we seeing here? And so it's roughly aggregated first-party Google Analytics data from direct data partnerships, right? So a firm will kind of opt in to allowing Grips Analytics to view its direct Google Analytics data. And so what we're going to mainly use this data set for is we're going to observe over time transactions and transaction value by a few things. And so the first thing, which is going to be important for our measure or for our analysis, is we're going to have some measure of referral source, right? So this is going to be coming from some last touch attribution, where basically, for instance, if I was on Facebook.com and then I went to, let's say, Nike.com and converted, this would attribute kind of a conversion back to Facebook. Importantly, we also observe device type and operating system, right? So we're going to be able to see, for instance, if a consumer, what fraction of purchases come from iOS versus Android. Okay. Now, in terms of panel composition, the group's intelligence data is going to cover a wide range of firms, and in particular, we're going to be able to track, nearly 116 billion in yearly revenue through this data set. And so important for our analysis, it's not just going to contain kind of exclusively direct-to-consumer firms, but also many sort of broader retailers that kind of, again, also have brick and mortar stores and such. And so when we're going to be doing our analysis, we're not necessarily going to be comparing kind of within DTC firms, but our treatment group will effectively have DTC firms in the treatment group with more non-DTC firms in the non-treatment group. Okay. And so this is the first data set we're going to have that's going to give us a broad measure of revenue. The second is going to come from an anonymous advertising analytics firm that's going to provide us aggregated data on spend performance on Meta, Google, and TikTok. And so what we're going to see is, again, weekly spend, number of impressions across campaigns, number of clicks across campaigns, and then the number of conversions that's kind of coming via the sort of pixel, right? So this kind of gives us a view from the perspective of a Meta or a Google or a TikTok, like how many conversions are they actually observing after the ATT event. And we're going to see some breakdown of this. So for instance, for Meta, we observe the campaign objectives, which we'll use in our analysis. For Google, we can see whether the spend was on search, display, etc. Okay. Now, from this data source B, we're going to have a subset of the data that's basically going to give us direct sales. We're going to have monthly revenue, and importantly, we're going to also be able to kind of have a point of sale identifier that's kind of, again, like an email or a phone number that's going to allow us to kind of, again, break down by new repeat customers, right? So we see the kind of end aggregation of what fraction of consumers were newer repeat consumers, okay? And again, just to kind of show you some broad summary stats of this. So again, you see here, the data sets have pretty decent variation. Both data sets contain a lot of these smaller direct-to-consumer type of firms. Data set B skews a little bit more towards smaller firms, but data set A data set A has a broader range of firms. We're going to have variation in both iOS and meta dependence in the data set A, which we're going to exploit in our analysis. Okay. And so that's the sort of policy details and data sources. Does anyone have any broad questions about the policy or the data before I start to get into the results, or? Okay, I will keep going then. So the first thing we want to look at here is we want to measure to what extent are meta ads in particular impacted. Okay. And so I'm just going to show you some event studies and what are these two things, right? So this thing up here is the CPP, which is basically just the average spend per pixel attributed conversion, right? So this is, again, given a firing of this meta pixel, what's the average amount of spend that has to go into kind of for each of those pixel conversions. And then the second down here is, again, an event study that looks at the log number of conversions, right? So this is, again, meta observed conversions. And how does this track over time? And so if you stare at these two things, there's kind of a clear point here where after ATT, there's a gradual increase up here, and then there's nearly a discontinuous increase in CPP. You see a similar pattern for conversions. And so again, it's pretty suggestive of a pretty large impact here, right? So this is roughly kind of a 50% increase in the cost per pixel attributed conversion. Now, a natural question is, you look at this, it's pretty suggestive that it's coming from ATT, but, can we do anything to kind of make us a little bit more confident in this? And so what I have here is, so this is the same CPP plot. And one thing which is somewhat nice about a policy like ATT is that basically whether or not, again, the end consumer kind of sees the opt-in prompt really depends on kind of them updating their devices, right? And so there's some slow adoption of kind of like whether or not people actually update to iOS 14.5. At some point in early June, kind of Apple pushes to kind of have a lot of people update their device. And so this red line here, you can see kind of the right side of the y-axis here is kind of the fraction of devices updated. And one thing which is kind of cool is, again, you can kind of see here, this is obviously there's no real adoption of ATT before. There's after April 25th, 2021, which is when the ATT comes into place, you see a gradual adoption, which again, almost exactly coincides with kind of the increase in CPP. And then whenever there's this big push to kind of get a lot of people on iOS 14.5, that's precisely the week in which you see this kind of spike in the sort of CPP, right? And so you see that the increase in CPP, again, precisely coincides with the adoption curve of iOS 14.5. Now, this is pretty suggestive that the effects are coming from ATT, but still this measure on the left-hand side has some measurement problems, right? And so ATT induces measurement issues both for Meta and for us as the econometrician, right? Because we are, again, only seeing what Meta's seeing. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take inspiration from kind of this Wernerfeld et al. Paper and kind of look at an observational analog to kind of what they do in their experiment. Where what we're going to want to do is, again, because we observe this breakdown of campaign objective within Meta, we can look at conversion optimized campaigns, which again are those that rely on this third-party pixel to kind of do attribution and measurement, to click optimized campaigns, which kind of all contain within the Meta ecosystem. And the nice thing about this is this kind of analysis is going to allow us to control for differences across advertisers, right? Because we're all looking at within advertiser comparisons. And again, is also going to potentially control for potentially meta adaptation over time, right? As Meta is making changes to its targeting algorithm, okay? And so in particular, the empirical specification we're going to do is a kind of a standard two-way fixed effect within advertiser difference and differences. And we're going to largely look at kind of two dependent variables here. The first are kind of success rates, right? How often does the campaign achieve its objective, right? And so in particular, in the case of conversion optimized, this is going to be off-platform conversions. In the case of click optimized, this is going to be clicks on the platform. And again, this first dependent variable is still subject to these same measurement issues. The second variable is kind of completely on platform, right? So there's going to be no potential measurement issue here. Now, when we're thinking about kind of like which advertisers to estimate the specification over, one thing we have to be a little bit tricky about, right, is one, there might be a concern that there's some reallocation here from off-platform to on-platform. And so again, I won't go in the details here, but we don't observe kind of too much substitution on the kind of advertisers switching from kind of off-platform to on-platform. We see a little bit of movement on the extensive margin, but largely advertisers on Meta kind of continue to predominantly use kind of off-platform conversions, even post-ATT. And again, anecdotally, this was so because kind of, Meta told people this was the most effective way to use the platform if they cared about off-platform conversions. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at a set of advertisers who had any spend on both objectives before ATT and kind of compare performance across time, okay? And so what is it that we find? And so again, the top panel here is this difference in differences for success rates. The bottom panel here is the difference in differences for click-through rates. And again, what you see is similar to what we saw before, which is, there seems to be a beginning of an effect the first 2 months, but then after ATT really kicks in and a lot of consumers adopt, you seem to see 3 or 4 months out a relatively steady kind of reduction in success rates and click-through rates, again, with some little variation coming from the holiday season. But in general, kind of, again, if you benchmark this to kind of the average click-through rate in the baseline period, the key takeaway is that kind of there's a 37% reduction in the click-through rate for conversion optimized ads, right? And so that increase that we saw before from the sort of increase in acquisition costs is not just a measurement issue, but there's actually a big reduction in effectiveness of ad effectiveness on Meta. Okay. Now, this leads to the natural question, which is, given reduced effectiveness of Meta ads, what did advertisers do? And so I think kind of, obviously, this is going to be relevant for thinking about this question of ATT, but another interpretation of kind of the ATT shock is to kind of view it as an exogenous reduction in kind of the quality of meta ads, right? And so in some sense, you can think about the kind of substitution exercise and whether or not it impacts downstream revenues as potentially also being useful for antitrust debates around meta, because it's going to teach us something about to what extent was kind of meta advertising substitutable for a lot of these advertisers pre-ATT or post-ATT. Okay. And so we're just going to have some pretty descriptive results here. And so what are we going to do? So again, we observe spend on Meta, Google, and TikTok. We're going to focus just on spend primarily because kind of the quantity variable here varies across ad platforms. On Google, you may be optimizing for clicks on Google search. On Meta, you may be, paying for clicks on Google search, whereas on Meta, you may be paying for impressions. And so we're just going to focus on spend primarily. And we're going to conduct two exercises, right? The first is kind of event study for relative spend shares across these different platforms. And the second is, again, more a differences for more meta-dependent advertisers. And so what is it that we find? And so again, in our sample here, kind of the baseline prevalence of Facebook ads was with a mean market share of 73% in the pre-period. And so what do you see here? You see that before ATT happens, there's not much change in kind of the relative spend share on Google or Facebook or Meta. And you kind of, again, after ATT, see a pretty stark reduction in overall spend on Meta and a gradual increase that's kind of offsetting this to some extent on Google, right? And so in terms of sort of relative reallocation, this kind of reduces the market share of Meta spend share by around 10% within our data set. Okay. And then the second thing we can do here is, again, we can kind of look at, are meta-dependent advertisers more likely to substitute? And so again, we can look at kind of an across advertiser here, difference in differences, where we look at the relative spend, impression, and click share across these different platforms. And again, it's suggestive that kind of more meta-dependent advertisers are likely to substitute. It somewhat suggests more substitution to Google Display than search, which again is relatively intuitive because Google Display is kind of the behavioral targeted advertising equivalent on Google. And so again, we're seeing some reallocation here. Okay. Okay.
Sorry, I just have a question.
Yeah.
So just like, would you be able to tell the spending magnitude instead of share? Is there any way to think about that?
Yeah, so we can look at the spending magnitude. Again, we get into details in the paper. There's a lot of weird stuff going on with ATT in terms of prices and changes in quality. And so we just focus on spend share here because we're kind of interested in sort of, is there a relative reallocation across these different platforms to give some sense for this? I agree that kind of like one could do a full-blown exercise of kind of measuring substitution patterns in a more disciplined way. But again, that exercise is very complicated in its own right. And so here we're just looking at some descriptive results.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, and so now, again, we've shown a reduction in effectiveness of meta ads. We've shown, again, some descriptive evidence for reallocation. And now we want to get into kind of the meat of the question, which is like, did this impact downstream firm outcomes, and in particular, the firm revenues? Okay. And so were firms able to mitigate the shock in this effectiveness? And again, there's kind of two interpretations here that I think are relevant for guiding kind of like how we want to think about this empirical exercise, right? So the main variable of interest here is going to be downstream firm revenue. And again, the first interpretation is if we primarily care about the impact on sort of DTC firms, which are inherently more meta-dependent, we kind of want to look at sort of some measure of pre-ATT meta-dependence. The second interpretation is, again, we can view this exercise as, being an exogenous shock to the quality of meta ads, which is going to give us some kind of revealed value for how valuable was meta advertising for these types of firms before ATT. Okay. And so our empirical strategy is going to be to stratify advertisers by pre-ATT dependence on meta. Okay. And so what we're going to do is, again, we're going to have a balanced panel of firms here that are in the data set. But in particular, we're going to use this measure that we have from data set A, which is the share of attributed revenue coming from Meta. And we're basically going to stratify firms kind of pre-ATT based on this relative share. Okay. And so we're going to define the share, again, from the year before Meta and define kind of treated firms here as being firms that kind of are above the median share of attributed revenue from Meta to firms that are kind of below the median share. And again, We'll have some alternative specifications using iOS, but this is going to be our main specification here. Okay? And again, here we're going to again be doing a two-way fixed effect difference and differences. But again, here we're kind of doing a cross advertiser as opposed to before within. And again, we're going to cluster our standard errors at the domain level. Okay. And so the first thing I want to look at is just plotting the data over time, right? And so this is, again, the dark line, the sort of non-dashed line here is the control group. The dashed line here is the treated group. And again, this is just plotting means, a logged mean a revenue over time. And again, you kind of see that the control group and the treated group match each other nearly perfectly until the onset of ATT, at which point they diverge. And you see that, again, the treated firms kind of have a reduction in their overall revenue. We then take this, again, to kind of the difference in difference specification, kind of looking at time-varying treatment effects here. And so again, what do you see here? The first is that there's no real evidence for pre-trends before ATT. And the second is that, again, kind of consistent with what we saw before, there seems to be some beginning of an effect the first couple months after ATT. And then roughly after 4 months, again, you kind of see a flatlining, right? So once kind of consumers have all adopted ATT, there seems to be a pretty persistent negative effect on revenue here, right? And so again, this is despite the fact that we know that Meta was doing kind of adaptation in terms of trying to move towards this more probabilistic attribution models. This is despite the sort of reallocation we see of some of these firms towards spending on Google, right? It kind of indicates that these firms were kind of unable to really substitute for their pre-ATT dependence on meta advertising, okay? And so what are the magnitudes of these effect sizes? And so again, we can then turn to kind of like the sort of standard difference and difference estimates here. And so again, the main two-way fixed effects estimates kind of leads to a roughly 37% reduction in revenues, right? Again, which is quite sizable, right? You think about, a 37% reduction in firm revenue is, big enough to kind of potentially deter entry from firms in the future. We can do a bunch of kind of alternative specifications for this to kind of show robustness. Again, one concern with our empirical analysis may be that some sort of categories are potentially more likely to be dependent on meta. And so again, we can kind of control for category month fixed effects to account for this. And again, we get nearly the same magnitude of the effects. We can look from 0 to 3 months and 4+ months. And again, the effect size is bigger if we kind of condition on the months when we kind of know that there was already full adaptation from the perspective of, or there was full adoption of ATT. Perhaps the starkest result here is we can do another specification where we stratify, where we kind of consider only the subsample of kind of smaller firms, which again, we're going to define here as below median revenue in our data set, and above median data set, we'll call large firms. And we find that most of this effect largely seems to be coming from these smaller firms, right? So this 37%, which seems pretty big, is potentially even higher for these smaller firms, which again is a little bit troubling in terms of the costs of this type of regulation. And then finally, we can look at whether or not kind of the overall number of transactions fell, which we find that roughly there's a 24% reduction in transactions. Okay, and so again, this is pretty sizable effect sizes. We can look at kind of another measure of this, right? You may say, okay, well, more natural measure of kind of pre-ATT dependence is the degree to which a firm is dependent on iOS sales, right? And we have some discussions in the paper, and we kind of this measure is correlated but not perfectly correlated with meta usage, and so this is capturing a potentially different measure of dependence. And again, I'm just showing you the time varying plot here, but you can look in the paper for the full tables. We basically find like nearly identical results when we look at kind of iOS dependence as opposed to meta dependence. Okay. Which again kind of seems to indicate that the effect sizes here are pretty large and pretty robust across reasonable ways of kind of doing this analysis. Okay. Now, the natural question may be, okay, so we've kind of independently shown advertising effectiveness seem to go down on meta, revenues seem to go down on more meta-dependent firms. We can kind of potentially tie this loop by kind of looking at the relative share of kind of new versus repeat orders, right? So if it's really kind of this reduced customer effect, consumer acquisition channel that's the driver of this revenue losses, we should see that, there's a reduction primarily in new customer orders. And so here we're kind of switching to use our data set B, which has this measure of kind of new versus returning customers. And the first thing we can do is, again, we have a measure of kind of like what is the fraction of orders that are from new versus repeat customers. And again, using this similar type of specification, we find that this corresponds to roughly kind of a 10% increase in the sort of repeat order ratio, right? And then we can break this out based on kind of like how many new customer orders were there, how many repeat customer orders were there, and we find pretty strong and, again, comparable effect sizes to kind of the reduction in new customer orders for kind of more meta-dependent firms. We don't seem to see kind of any potential offsetting coming from repeat customers, right? So one alternative theory may have been that sort of these firms can put additional money in kind of retaining and increasing the order value for additional consumers. Again, we don't seem to see much evidence of this, but we also, again, seem to find that the revenue impact is largely driven by the loss of new customer acquisition here. Okay. And then again, we have some additional robust for this revenue results using the Shopify data. We can control for changes in firm side costs, use different measures of dependence, and we find similar types of effects. Okay. Okay. So I think I'm nearly out of time. So let me finish up here by, again, sort of concluding what we find in this paper. And so we think, again, our paper kind of contributes to this debate around the economic costs of privacy regulation. Again, ATT is a particularly nice policy for measuring the effect of opt-in privacy regulation, given the transparency to consumers, the high opt-in rates, we can really measure the effects here. What are our main empirical results? Again, we find a 37% reduction in these click-through rates for conversion optimized meta ads. We see some reallocation from Meta to Google. Despite this reallocation, we find that kind of more meta-dependent firms have a pretty large reduction in revenue of nearly 37%, and this largely harms small firms. What are the kind of, again, key policy and managerial takeaways from this? And so I think, again, the magnitude of the effect sizes, in particular for smaller firms, kind of points to ATT potentially threatening the viability of a lot of these direct-to-consumer business models. And so again, I think this kind of opens up the question of, when we're thinking about the sort of consumer welfare benefits of this regulation, like undoubtedly consumers are getting a lot of benefits from kind of being able to additionally protect their privacy. I think one thing which our paper points to is that it's potentially also going to be important to understand the sort of consequences on downstream product markets and how that affects consumer welfare, to kind of do a full welfare analysis of these type of policies. The second is that, again, if we view sort of ATT as being an exogenous shock to the effectiveness of meta ads, and seeing what that teaches us about kind of its value and the degree to which advertisers can substitute, I think, again, given the magnitude of the revenue reductions, I think it's hard to argue that the pre-ATT value of meta ads for these firms was high, but the fact that they were unable to kind of adapt to this also does suggest that there are potentially limited viable substitutes for these firms, right? And so we think this provides some useful evidence for the antitrust debates around Meta. Okay, and so with that, I will kick it over to Garrett. And thanks in advance, Garrett.
Yeah, so thanks, Guy, for the presentation. So Gary, please go ahead with your discussion.
Sounds good. Well, thank you for the opportunity to discuss what I think is a really outstanding paper. ATT is perhaps the most consequential restriction on modern identity-based digital advertising. But at the time, the public and academic discussion did not seem to really appreciate this point. And the first papers on this literature focused on the consequences for apps, which is important, but the impact on advertisers is a critical part of the story as well. Now, of course, it's one thing to say that, it's another to obtain really good data, and the authors obtain multiple useful data sets that clarify this question. And so they have a very nice contribution, which is to show the value of digital advertising, and specifically identity-based advertising, to the economy, showing that advertising plays a critical role in growing firm revenue and in fostering competition. So my only complaint really about this paper is that I wish I would have written it. So a couple kind of overarching comments. The first is to be less bashful about the policy takeaways. So yesterday, the news came out that the European Commission is going to prosecute Meta under the Digital Markets Act for offering consent or pay, but not offering this third option with this so-called contextual advertising. And this is part of a larger move by the European Commission that seems to be very suspicious of targeted advertising, identity-based advertising. And I think the message of this paper is that whatever privacy benefits these policies provide, they have a substantial cost to firms and a substantial cost to competition, and we should maybe be thinking critically about these regulations. I think they also should be framing the contribution as informing the ongoing antitrust investigation against Apple. So Apple unilaterally imposed the ATT policy on its platform. And notably, as part of this, it characterized its competitors' use of ad identifiers as tracking, but its own use of ad identifiers as personalization. And while hampering the ad efforts of its competitors, Apple was able to grow its own ad revenue to the tune of 238%. So its search ads program grew by $3.7 billion in 2021. And as a result of this, there's multiple antitrust investigations of Apple. So France issued a statement of objection in 2023. There's 4 French online advertising groups that actually sued Apple for an antitrust complaint in 2020. The US is investigating Apple's mobile platforms, which may include ATT. And the CMA, the British Competition Authority, prominently discussed ATT in its mobile ecosystems market study. So I say all this because the paper's findings are material for calculating potential damages or fines, and I think the authors could play that up a bit. And then my second major comment is that I'd like the authors to do a better job of placing their findings in context. So the estimated treatment effects are really high at almost 40% for revenue. So I just want more context to think about this. So I think one critical piece of data that would be very easy for the authors to provide is what is the share of revenue attributable to Meta and to iOS in the pre-period for the treatment versus the control groups. You know, we see in the summary statistics that the 5th and 95th percentile for Meta ranges from 0 to 18%, which is quite low relative to those effects. For iOS share, it's between 3 and 51%, which would be more commensurate with those effects. Admittedly, this doesn't give you the whole picture because we know that these shares are on a last click attribution basis, and we know that the relationship between incrementality and last click attribution is not 1-to-1, albeit we do have some great research from Brett Gordon, Guy Aridor's colleague at Kellogg, quantifying this relationship across many different experiments. I also would be interested to see the effect computed by device and operating systems to compute iOS-specific effects. Admittedly, the authors are interested in this kind of general equilibrium, post-adjustment effect, which I think is all well and good. My interest in the iOS-specific partial effect would be as more of a validation check, because really that is where we should see the largest effect of AT&T, and so it would be nice to break that apart. So again, really, really great paper, very important contribution to literature and to a very important and active policy discussion, and I commend the authors for really excellent work on this subject.